Hello, everyone. I hope all of you are enjoying the Asia TEFL 2020 conference. My name is Eun-Sung Park from Sogang University, and I'm very happy and honored to introduce our next plenary speaker, Dr. John Norris. You probably know him very well, but let me just give you a brief summary of his work and achievements. John is Senior Research Director at the Center for Language Education and Assessment Research at ETS, where he manages research on English language teaching, learning, and assessment. Prior to joining ETS, he was Associate Professor at Georgetown University. He also worked as Associate Professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and as Assessment Specialist at Northern Arizona University. John's teaching and research focus on language education, especially task-based language teaching, assessment, program evaluation, and research methods. He has published widely on these topics, but because of time constraints, I'll just share a few of his most recent books, which include titles such as Second Language Educational Experiences for Adult Learners, Improving and Extending Quantitative Reasoning in Second Language Research, and Innovation and Accountability in Foreign Language Program Evaluation. John's plenary talk is entitled Task-Based Language Teaching and the Presence of Meaningful Language Education. Because it's 3 a.m. in the East Coast, he sent us a pre-recorded video. But he will be available to answer any questions after the talk, so please feel free to ask your questions using the live chat function. Now, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. John Norris.
Hi, I'm Dr. John Norris from the Educational Testing Service in Princeton, New Jersey in the United States. I'm very happy to be joining you at the Asia TEFL conference today. I would be happier if I could actually be there in Korea in person, but we have to do what we have to do these days. Let me congratulate the organizers of the Asia TEFL conference for putting on such a great event and making it possible for those of us who can't be there in person to at least connect virtually and still be able to offer our thoughts and presentations. Let me also express my gratitude to the organizers of Asia TEFL for inviting me to share some of my ideas about what I think is a pretty important topic these days. It's a real honor to be able to talk with you all about something I've been thinking and working on for quite some time. So the focus of my talk today is task-based language teaching and the practice of meaningful language education. So we're all somewhat or quite familiar with general ideas about TBLT, task-based language teaching. And today I would like to focus on what I think are the more meaningful aspects of TBLT. There are a lot of different definitions and interpretations of task-based practice in language education. So let me offer one that my colleagues and I provided a few years ago. TBLT is an approach to designing language educational experiences and everything that they entail, from curriculum to assessments, involving both the use of communicative tasks within the classroom and the development of abilities to engage in meaningful language use beyond the classroom. In TBLT, the notion of task indicates language learning activities in which students are required to use language with a primary focus on meaning in order to achieve some communicative outcome. So you see from these two quotes that in TBLT, meaning and meaningfulness are really at the heart of the endeavor. What I'd like to do today then is drill down a little bit on these two aspects of meaningfulness that I think really should be the defining characteristics of task-based language teaching. One aspect of meaningfulness has to do with TBLT emphasizing learning language to communicate meaningfully. That is, for a real purpose, to a real audience, and with a real outcome. In TBLT, the learning objective is ability to use language to communicate meaning. The learning process of TBLT has to do with language being acquired through doing meaning-making tasks in the classroom or elsewhere. And the ultimate learning outcomes of TBLT should be societally meaningful language education that produces effective language users. These are key characteristics of the meaning-making side of task-based language teaching. But there's more to the meaningfulness of TBLT than just that. TBLT also derives pedagogic principles from notions of meaningful education. There's a rich history of a focus on meaningful education dating back at least to John Dewey's notions of experiential education, but also including the work by Ausubel, Bruner, Kolb, Piaget, and others. What are the implications then, or the characteristics of meaningful language learning? In TBLT, we design educational experiences to maximize meaningful language learning that is deep, effective, valuable, and lasting. We do that by drawing on a handful of principles that have emerged out of years of experience, research, theory, and so on. For example, language learning needs to be related to learners' lives, their goals, their needs. Language learning needs to be connected to what learners already know. Learners build from what they know, add on new knowledge on the basis of association with what they already know. Language learning should create knowledge through experience. Knowledge on its own, without application, without embedding in context, is not very useful knowledge. TBLT builds on the creation of knowledge through experiential learning. We draw on discovery and problem-solving activities in order to make the learning deeper and more meaningful. Language learning that is meaningful requires individual learning effort. The more effort a learner invests within the learning activity, the more they're going to get out of it. It also builds critically on opportunities for reflection about learning and feedback from others, often expert others, about the outcomes of learning. Meaningful language learning values critically human-human interactions. At the base of language learning, there is the need to communicate to another human. Involving human-human interaction in the learning experience is therefore a critical dimension of meaningful language learning. And ultimately, meaningful language learning results in tangible success. Learners need to see the value of the language that they've acquired, applied, used for meaningful communication to realize its importance. All of these aspects of meaningful learning have been applied in various ways to the design of task-based language teaching. So these pedagogic characteristics really underlie the design of what it is that we try to do in the task-based classroom. TBLT then derives from these two notions of meaningfulness. On the one hand, learning language to communicate meaningfully. On the other hand, maximizing meaningful language learning by drawing on these kinds of pedagogic principles. These two sources then, ideally, are applied to the design of entire language educational programs and all of the things that characterize them. Teachers, learners, and institutions, curriculum, materials, pedagogy, and assessment, syllabus design, and lesson design. I think the best way to see these characteristics or these principles in action, though, is to examine in some detail the design of meaningful task-based language lessons. So let's turn to just that. What I'd like to focus on for the talk today is designing TBLT lessons to maximize meaningful learning. The focus on lessons, of course, is also related to the kinds of activities that language teachers have the most control over and play the biggest and most important role within. A couple of guiding questions for us today. I would like for you to focus as we move through the next section on, first of all, what do we think are the main components of a TBLT lesson design? And second, how are key TBLT principles applied at each stage of lesson design to make learning meaningful? Now, along the way, we're going to have help from a teacher character, and this teacher character is going to offer her insights and guide us through the different stages of the lesson that she has designed. So, let's get started. She's welcoming us to her task-based lesson and posing this important question. Within a TBLT lesson design, what do you think is going to happen first? Let's find out. So what have we just seen? What's happening in the scene that you just saw and heard? The teacher might pose that question to her class. Who's there? What are they doing? This, of course, is an opportunity to get the students interested in the topic of the lesson. And it's also a way for the teacher to situate or frame what it is that the lesson is going to be about and focusing on. Additionally, here, the teacher might remind the students that at the beginning of the year or the semester, they participated in a survey of their interests and needs. And two of the goals that they might have identified at that point could have been things like, 1, talking with other students in English, and 2, succeeding on TOEFL IBT speaking tasks. Test tasks can be very real needs for students, especially those who, in this case, might be preparing to go and study abroad at a university in North America, for example. This background then allows a teacher to situate the lesson and open with the following description. College students often work together in groups to complete assignments outside of class. They're also really busy. They have to coordinate their schedules so they can work together. In this unit, you will talk with other students to plan a meeting. You will also develop the ability to express preferences, likes, and dislikes. So, which TBLT principles is the teacher drawing on in opening the lesson in this way? 1. The lesson should be designed on the basis of a target task, that is, a real-life task that students do outside the language classroom. And 2, target tasks should relate to students' personal goals. The lesson is based on identified student needs, so it is meaningful to them. In this case, the focus of the lesson, the target tasks, have to do with making plans with other students and preparing for the TOEFL IBT independent speaking task, which involves expressions of preference and opinion, and we'll see that that is integrated into the making plans task as well. Now, what happens next in the lesson design? Here, our teacher offers the students the opportunity to examine different locations that might be useful for or typical of study activities outside of the classroom in the college environment. She provides the following instructions to individual students. On your own, study the pictures and answer the questions. Can you describe each location? What kind of place is it? What's happening in each place? Who are the people and what are they doing? What is similar and what is different between each location? After a while, the students have studied on their own, come up with answers. The teacher might then move on to an introductory interactive kind of task. With a partner, talk about it. Which place is better for studying on your own and why? Which place is better for working on a group project and why? And the teacher might introduce some new aspects that have cultural meaning that might generate more interest and interaction among the students. For example, examples of signs that might appear in cafes or other study locations, like 1 drink minimum or no laptops before 1 p.m. And then she encourages the students to talk about what they think the signs mean. So what's happening here in terms of key TBLT principles? First, students recall and build schema based on what they already know about the target task and situation, including aspects of the setting, participants, and purposes for communication. Second, student interest is generated by having them experience and talk about what different aspects of the target task mean. They're getting ready, they're understanding, they're developing an interest, and perhaps they're developing curiosity about the use of language within the target task. So what happens next? Here, the teacher asks the students to listen to a conversation between 2 university students who are doing something quite similar to the ultimate target task. The class participants are to listen for overall meaning without taking any notes, simply trying to process what it is that they're hearing the 2 students talk about. So let's see.
Hey Michelle, we have to get to work on this project soon. I can't afford to get another bad grade this semester.
I know, I'm so busy and midterms are next week. If it were up to me, this would be an individual project. Ugh. Can you remind me again what we have to do?
Well, let's see. First, we have to get together with John and Sabrina to look at the results of our survey. Then we have to come up with a presentation and design the slides. And after we're done with that, we have to decide who's going to present on what parts.
Ugh, I hate presenting in front of the class, but I don't mind designing presentation slides.
Yeah, I think Sabrina's a pretty good presenter, but I've never seen John give a presentation, so I don't know about him. And as for me, I don't really care if I present or not.
Okay, so we have to meet as a group. I'd rather get it over with today. Where should we meet?
Well, the library's got those big study rooms, but they keep the AC really low, so maybe not.
Yeah, it's kind of boring in there anyway, and we'll never get a room if we want to meet tonight.
Yeah. hmm. I could kill for a coffee, so why not Starbucks?
Yeah, good idea. Me too. But we need space if we're going to work as a group.
Yeah, and it does get noisy in there.
Yeah. Oh, why don't we try that new cafe on the corner by the bookstore? They have great caramel lattes.
Okay, so you've seen a bit of the model or example target task performance by these university students. And the teacher has shared this with her class and asked them to listen and try to figure out what's going on. Now she might move on to a next phase with a partner, talk about it, asking the students to consider these questions. What do the students have to do for the project? What locations did they consider? And where did they decide to go and why? So what principles are being applied here at this stage in the TBLT lesson? First, students are exposed to examples of task performance so that they can see what the target task looks like in real life and how language is actually used. In doing so, students are focusing on meaning first. They're trying to figure out what's going on and process what they've heard. Students are potentially learning by association. They're seeing the contexts, they're understanding the purposes of communication. They may be then adding in new language knowledge as a result. Students may also be identifying gaps in their understanding and knowledge. There may be things that they don't understand, but they realize where they need to understand and what they're trying to get to in order to process the communication. And potentially students are learning from each other. As they discuss what it is that they've heard in the model conversation, they're able to give each other new knowledge, new tips, new insights, and also help each other identify important gaps in the communication that's happening. So what happens next in the TBLT lesson? Making the most of the input, the teacher asks the students to listen to the conversation again, and in doing so, write down all of the words and phrases that are used to express a preference, a like, or a dislike. Then discuss with a partner. Now we're getting to the opportunity for the students to do some focus on form. Here they're going to be trying to, through listening activities, understand how language is used to express a preference, like, or dislike. Additionally, the teacher might follow up with a transcript. Here we see some segments of a transcript from that very model conversation. And she might ask the students to compare their lists with the highlighted words and phrases in the transcript that are used to express a preference or a like. For example, if it were up to me, I hate, I don't mind, I don't really care, I could kill for, I'm okay with. These are all examples of how the students actually express preferences, likes, and dislikes within the model conversation. What principles are being applied here then? First, students are analyzing language input in the target task and discussing with classmates to discover for themselves how language is used to convey meaning in the target task. Students then are focusing on form now, but within a meaningful communication context. Critically, by doing so, they should be able to link the form in this case expressions of preference like dislike, with its function in making meaningful communication happen. Another step in the TBLT lesson design that might make the most sense at this point could involve the teacher bringing the student's attention more closely to the use of different language forms to express particular types of meaning. So she might initiate a full class discussion, for example, on how to generate expressions of preference like and dislike, explaining things like nominal, infinitive, and gerundal phrases. She might also then have the students engage in an activity that tries to allocate particular phrases or expressions to stronger or weaker or more positive or negative ways of expressing likes and dislikes and preferences. Here then, what TBLT principles are at play? First, teachers are focusing on form when it is most meaningful to students. That is, embedded in the context of task communication and specific to the language students need to do the task. These are critical aspects of meaningful approaches to language learning from a task-based point of view. So what happens next? Now the teacher is ready and believes that the learners are ready to move on to at least a portion of a target task. Here she describes it as follows. You and a partner will meet later with 2 other members of your group. Each of the other members has texted you with their information. Your job is to compare their suggestions with the 4 possible locations in the photos. You have 2 locations, your partner has 2 locations. Work together to decide where to meet later on to complete your group project. So this is setting up one of the identified target tasks that we saw earlier. Here then, this is an information gap task. The students have to call and talk with each other to discuss the preferences of the other team members as well as their own, describe the meeting locations, and decide which is the best place for the group to study. So student A might have input from one fellow student, John, who says things like, I don't mind when we meet, today's wide open, if it's late, we need to have a place that serves food, call me later with directions. Also in the input provided to student A are graphical depictions of photographs of potential cafes or other locations where the students might meet to do their project, and some textual input that describes things like how long the hours are for the given location, whether they serve food, and so on. Student B then has information from another fellow student, as well as information on additional places where the students might meet to do their group project. And obviously, some of the information from student B's input will conflict with some of the information from student A's input, such that they'll have to interact, communicate with each other, adjudicate what it is that they've found out from their fellow students and about possible places to study, and then finally come to some kind of a decision that probably best fits the needs of the 4 different members of the project team. So what's the teacher doing while the students are engaging in this information gap interactive activity? Well, typically the teacher would be, at least in a face-to-face classroom, moving around, monitoring the pairs of students as they engage in the interaction, mostly letting the task unfold and run on its own, but potentially intervening here and there where the students might need a hand, making sure that the task progresses, possibly offering a little focus on form where it might help the students to progress, and so on. What are the TBLT principles then underlie this interactive phase of the task design? First, students are given a reason to engage in meaningful communication due to the lack of shared information. That's the beauty of an information gap task activity. Second, students interact realistically with each other in order to convey information, receive information, and to make a decision. That's another real positive aspect of this kind of information gap activity. And third, students are focusing on form to complete the task. They have to process information that they receive from their partner. They have to create information that's meaningful to their partner, and all of that involves the use of language forms to convey meaning. Lastly, the teacher allows the task to unfold largely, choosing to focus on form as needed during the task or potentially reserving a focus on form until a post-task phase where she might offer additional comments on key challenges or repeated patterns that she noticed as the students were interacting with each other. So what happens next? An additional target task now places the onus on the individual students to take responsibility and make something happen, make some meaningful communication happen. Here, the target task is to leave a voice message. Using the notes from your discussion, call one of the other team members, leave a voice message about where you will meet and why you have chosen that location. After trying that task for a first time, the students may be asked to self-assess or assess with a partner. So play back the message and rate your performance on a simple scale from weak to good. Compare and explain your ratings with each other and repeat for your partner's message. Ultimately, the purpose of doing this kind of assessment is formative. The students are asked, how can you improve your performance on this task? And this leads to them then, of course, trying it out again. Target task part 3 involves task repetition. Now, your job is to call the second friend and leave a new voice message. And then submit this recording to your teacher for feedback, assessment, and potentially grading. What are the key TPLT principles at stake here? First, students are taking responsibility for producing meaningful communication on their own. Second, students, hopefully, are realizing the relationship between language form and making meaning by completing the target task, hopefully using some of what they've learned in the preceding stages of the TBLT lesson design. And students are given the opportunity to reflect and to receive feedback on their performance, followed by the opportunity to do the task again. Lastly, the teacher provides feedback on target task performances, focusing though on students' ability to make meaning. What happens next? Lastly, the teacher might give the students the opportunity to tackle one of the other target tasks that they had identified on the needs analysis that we saw at the beginning of the lesson design. Now let's use what we have learned to practice another target task, a speaking task on an English proficiency test. Here, the students will attempt a TOEFL IBT independent task, and an example of which would be something like the prompt, students often like to study in cafes, alone or in groups. What do you think are the benefits of studying in a cafe compared with studying in the library or at home? Which would you prefer to do? Explain your reasons. What principles are at stake here? Well, the lesson is finishing where it started, coming full circle back to doing one kind of target task that is meaningful to the students. That is, in this case, a language proficiency assessment task. So let me recap a little bit about what we've seen in terms of the meaningful learning and meaningful communication underlying task-based language lesson design. Here we've seen more or less 6 different phases of the TBLT lesson, each of which features dimensions of meaningful communication as well as meaningful learning. In phase 1, the identification of the target task and situation, we focused on the real-life language use tasks that were of interest to students, and this was based on the learner's goals, needs, and interests as expressed in needs analysis. Those target tasks and situations then determined the focus and goals of the particular lesson design. Phase 2 moved on to schematization or schema building, where the language use setting, purposes, and participants served as the meaningful communication focus. And learners built on what they already knew and identified maybe what they needed to learn, these being key processes from a meaningful learning perspective. In phase 3, learners were exposed to target task input and a target task model, other students doing the target task. Here, the meaningfulness of communication was emphasized through the exposure to authentic, holistic language use by others. And meaningful learning was emphasized through learning by association and identifying gaps in knowledge or understanding on the part of the students. In phase 4, learners had the opportunity to drill down into the input by analyzing it, focusing on language form in meaning as the example students were having a conversation and in particular expressing their preferences, likes, and dislikes, and discovering new knowledge from a meaningful learning perspective. Here, students had the opportunity to really see language form being used to convey meaning and therefore discover something that filled in some of the gaps that they might have identified earlier. Critically, in phase 5, learners were connected with each other in an interactive information gap activity where they had to use language to make meaning and they had to exert effort, interact, perhaps receive some scaffolding from each other or from the teacher and offer and receive feedback. And finally, in phase 6, learners completed the cycle by engaging in target task performances of several kinds. Here, focusing on the real-life dimensions of task accomplishment, actually having to use language to communicate meaningfully, and from a learning perspective, experiencing success and potentially some failure, reflecting, receiving feedback, having the opportunity to try out the target task again. These then, I think, are examples of some of the critical phases in a TBLT lesson design that emphasizes these two dimensions of meaningfulness. Focus on meaningful communication and meaningful language learning activities. So let me wrap up then by returning to some of the fundamental principles or key aspects of making language education meaningful and why I think this might be something important for us to consider. First of all, it's clear that task-based language teaching emphasizes both of these dimensions and in a relatively balanced way. Task-based language teaching is about learning language to communicate meaningfully, and it is also based upon principles of meaningful language learning. Those two dimensions of meaningfulness then should infuse all of the aspects of the design of good, effective language education programs that are based on TBLT. We've seen in today's talk a focus on the lesson design and the different elements of lesson design, but these aspects also have implications for various other dimensions of the educational program and learning environment, from the assessments and materials and curriculum to syllabus design to how teachers and learners engage and interact with each other, and so on. All of those aspects are, of course, important in influencing the meaningfulness of the educational experience. I think, though, I would like to emphasize the critical role played, the absolutely essential role played by teachers in making meaningful TBLT happen. Our teacher character showed different aspects of participation by the teacher that is crucial to meaningful language learning. For example, teachers have to understand their learners, their needs, their interests, their linguistic profiles in order to design meaningful lessons. Teachers introduce tasks, motivate learners, draw learners' attention to important features of the communication situation, the environment, the participants, and so on. Teachers provide focus on form at appropriate points during the lesson cycle. No one is better situated than a teacher to be able to intervene and offer a focus on form when it's most meaningful to a learner engaged in some task-based activity. Teachers facilitate interaction. They monitor participation by different learners. They encourage engagement. Teachers, critically, offer focused feedback, highlighting the role of language form in making meaning, and they do so in different ways at different points within a task-based lesson. Ultimately, teachers also have to plan the next meaning-focused, meaningful language learning lesson based on what they've observed, what worked, what didn't work in the preceding lesson, and what they know the learner's needs and interests and language learning needs are. Teachers then, from my perspective, are the ultimate enactors of TBLT. By localizing task-based lesson design in all of these ways that we see above, they enhance the meaningfulness of language learning. Teachers are crucial. So let me conclude then with just a few thoughts about the big picture. I believe language education is societally meaningful to the extent that it develops the human ability to communicate with respect and cultural understanding in more than one language. This is part of the mission statement of the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, and I believe it captures really at a base level what we're all hopefully trying to do through language education. TBLT then maximizes the meaningfulness of language education by focusing on the goal of meaningful communication between people and the practice of meaningful learning by people. I think these two dimensions of TBLT make it uniquely suited to inform language education programs and language teaching practice that really gets to this ability to communicate with respect and cultural understanding in more than one language. In a time where we are increasingly inundated by technology-mediated communication, AI, and all these other technological affordances, I think it's important for us to maybe remind ourselves that ultimately, fundamentally, language education is about communicating between humans. It's about developing learners' abilities to read what people have written, to listen to other people, to offer their opinions, to do all the kinds of things that we do when we interact with other people. Language education is ultimately a humanistic undertaking, and I think this is an opportune moment for us to reflect on that and to think about the role of TBLT in maybe maximizing the meaningfulness of that endeavor. With that then, I will thank you all for your attention. I will attempt to say the one word in Korean that I think I know, 감사합니다, and I would be happy to talk further with you about this in the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that interesting and meaningful talk. I'm sure we learned a lot about the key principles of TBLT from your talk. Now, hi, it's like 3 a.m. or 3:30, almost 4 a.m. there, right?
Good morning.
Good morning. We have some comments about how they really enjoyed the talk here. We have several comments, but we don't have questions per se. So Asia TEFL audience, I know you're very interested in TBLT. If you have questions, this is your chance. We don't get chances like this very often. So please type your questions and John will answer them for you. In the meantime, somebody named So-young said that she really loved the lesson that you provided on the slide.
Oh, thank you.
And
I hope it was meaningful.
And Tilasha Mola Goda, I don't know where this person is from, but thank you very much. Oh, sorry. The screen disappeared. So, yeah, but anyway.
Well, I would encourage people to feel free to use any aspects of that example lesson in their own teaching, or modify it, or take advantage of it. And actually, if people do that, I would love to hear from them about what they've done and how it worked, and how they might have altered the lesson, how their students responded, and so on.
Oh, we have a question here from Alex. How can we fit TBLT into 45 minutes?
Into short classes, indeed. Well, Well, and localized, like I mentioned at the end of my talk. So I think, spreading out the different components of the lesson design is one option. So obviously you're not going to do everything that I showed you in that particular lesson design in a 45-minute period, but you can carve out pieces of it. And then hopefully your lessons aren't too widely dispersed so that students forget from one lesson to the next what it is that they did in the last one. I suppose another way to do that would be to take advantage of outside of class learning. And I think a lot of that is, in fact, more of that is going on now through these kind of virtual connections that learners are establishing with each other and with their teachers. And so trying to create a more seamless learning experience is critical. But granted, 45-minute lesson is not a lot. So I wish you luck.
We have another question from Park Chu-kyung. Thank you for the informative presentation. It is a pleasure to listen to a presentation from you. Is there any risk of distracting the students' focus from meaning by adding the focus on form prior to, can you control the screen so that I, prior to, and then I missed it. Yeah, sorry. So is there any risk of distracting the students' focus on meaning by adding the focus on form prior to the meaningful activity?
Mm-hmm. So I think that is a risk and something we need to be conscious of. I would say that the key in the lesson design that I was demonstrating anyway is to start with embedding the students and all of the focus of the lesson in this orientation towards the target task. If making sure that that's established and that the learners understand that they're in this environment of a target task and that everything they're going to do is related to that ultimate target task, I think that's the most crucial point. And then, yes, we have to be careful about where we select opportunities to embed a focus on form. Sometimes that may come after the doing of a meaningful activity. Sometimes it might come interspersed in the middle of a variety of meaningful activities. But certainly that's something to be conscious of. And I think that's, really it takes a careful, observant teacher to make the most of the opportunities for focusing on form. And that has to do with the teacher's understanding of the learners, what they need, where they are in their learning trajectory, and how all of that is related to the target task and the language that's needed in the target task. But I definitely would not advocate for separating the focus on form, teaching that independently, and then doing a target task. I think all of these things need to be closely integrated in one way or another.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. There is another question from Melak Kubayu. How do we apply TBLT if we have large class size? Do you have any tips for that?
So I think large class sizes certainly can be challenging in that the teacher might not be able to do all of the kinds of monitoring activities that the teacher might want to or need to. It can be challenging in terms of assessing each learner's progress on a continuing basis. At the same time, then again, we have to localize and adapt. And so I do think that most of what I was showing there could be exercised. Most of those steps in the lesson design could be exercised in a large class format. It's just that you're going to have to do things like rotate your monitoring of students. So you pay attention to some students in some lessons and other students in other lessons. You do maybe an increased amount of peer assessment because the teacher might not be able to compensate for all of the assessment that needs to be done. So I think there are a variety of strategies for nevertheless trying to take advantage of those principles that I was introducing. Although again, maybe it's not going to be as effective as in an ideally sized class, whatever that might be. I have in a book that Eunsoon mentioned at the beginning, Designing Educational Experiences for Adult Learners, we have a whole chapter on these kinds of challenges that teachers face and how we make a lot of recommendations for how you might adapt in response to things like large classes. So that's another source for maybe a few ideas on that.
Now we're getting a lot of questions here.
Uh-oh.
To what extent do teachers need to consider students' MI, multiple intelligences, and learning style to implement TBLT?
I think TBLT is really uniquely suited to different learning styles and different approaches that learners have, um, because everybody can have their own way into a task. I mean, I think fundamentally the goal is the same, and regardless of what your learning style is, you're going to have to be able to use language to communicate in the end. That's why we're doing language education in the first place. But tasks are holistic and rich enough that people can approach them in their own ways. At the same time, the teacher probably plays an important role in adapting or adjusting focus on form or the introduction of the task or the assessment of the task performance for learners who are approaching the task in their own ways, in different ways. And sometimes it's important to confront learners if their particular approach isn't leading to, let's say, the most efficient or effective language development that might be necessary. Sometimes, it's hard to do things, and we have to figure out how to deal with the hard things about language use. And so the teacher's role here is critically important too, and figuring out what the learner is doing and how to adjust the lesson and the content accordingly.
Okay. I think we can take maybe one more question. We have a question from Nur Ani from Indonesia. And this is actually a very relevant question because we are all teaching via Zoom this semester. How do we design and adopt these TBLT issues for, where did that go? Oh. How do we design and adopt these TBLT issues for our online big classes, such as 38 students in the class, and they have different condition in teaching and learning process?
Yeah, that's a great question and something that we're all dealing with these days. Funnily enough, just recently I've been working with a classroom and a teacher videotaping the implementation of task-based lessons, very much like what I was just talking about in a Zoom environment. And actually, what we're finding is that there are a lot of benefits of these kinds of virtual settings. So you have all of these technological dimensions like breakout rooms and different kinds of grouping and sizing and pairing that can go on. You also have a sort of built-in information gap possibilities where learners can't necessarily see or know what it is that's going on the other side with a learner in another location. And so I think it's an interesting time and an interesting environment to sort of exercise our creativity. But I would say that virtually everything that I showed in that lesson can and actually is being done in the virtual environment as well. It takes a little adaptation and maybe a little more time to figure out how it's going to work in the online environment. But I think all of these things are imminently possible. The one downside might be that you do lose a bit of the human-human interaction, contact. There's the essence of the communication is changed. And I think that's unfortunate. It'll be nice when we can get back to other ways of interacting with each other in a more face-to-face or personal space. But I do think that a lot of this is quite doable also in the virtual environment.
Thank you. I think our time is up. We have actually 1 minute, maybe one quick question because we have so many now. From Jane Janet Wang, can you recommend some textbooks which are based on TBLT approach and designing activities in teaching English?
So textbooks as in textbook materials for use in your classroom. I think that's probably what the question is. And I'm going to refrain from recommending anything right now. I think it's a little bit problematic if I endorse anything. I do think there's actually a lot of useful stuff out there on the market, and increasingly so. And some of my friends in Asia in particular have published quite interesting materials for different contexts like business English or professional English or academic English. And so I'll just say that I'm encouraged by some of the materials that I've seen coming out recently, some of the textbook materials. But always with TBLT, I think there's a need for the teacher to be sophisticated in using those materials, and I think it requires adaptation and localization. And so it's really what the teacher does with the materials that's important. And that should be based on a good understanding of the learners, a good understanding of the principles and the aims of the course and things like that. So I would never recommend materials on their own as, you know, the curriculum or the syllabus to guide everything that happens in the classroom. Teachers are really crucial.
Okay, so as long as a teacher has a good concept of all the principles, he or she can use TBLT with any kind of textbook. That's what I'm hearing.
Potentially so. You can certainly take advantage of a lot of different textbook materials that are out there. Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you so much. I know this is early in the morning for you. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you. Big round of applause for, yeah, thank you.
Have a nice conference. Thank you.
So.
Thank you.
영어 시험의 기준 탭스 공인 영어 점수 역시 탭스 이거 하나면 충분하지 탭스 탭스 영어 시험의 기준 탭스 공인 영어 점수 역시 탭스 이거 하나면 충분하지 탭스 탭스 높아진 취업 문턱 가볍게 넘어가자 천리길도 한 걸음부터 두렵지 않아 원 스텝 투 스텝 단어도 이제 익숙해 탭스와 함께라면 헤쳐나갈 수 있지 어렵지 않은 숙제 600 고개 자신 있음 도전해 각종 자격증 시험에도 유용해 활용도 높은 인증서 높은 변별력까지 든든한 무기야 스텝 바이 스텝 탭스 영어 시험의 기준 탭스 공인 영어 점수 역시 탭스 이거 하나면 충분하지 탭스 탭스 영어 시험의 기준 탭스 공인 영어 점수 역시 탭스 이거 하나면 충분하지 탭스 탭스
For every test of your patience, for every challenge to your plans, there is one English test that gives you the confidence to move forward in a world on pause. TOEFL IBT Special Home Edition, because you've worked so hard and your high standards should never be compromised. TOEFL IBT, the test the world trusts from the safety of home. TOEFL IBT Special Home Edition.
Our promise for your tomorrow. In January 1999, our test was released, establishing a standard for English education and assessment. In May 2018, a revised version of the test was released with a reduced number of test items and test taking time. A new item type was added, and the maximum total score was adjusted. As a result of our continued research and development, our test is recognized widely and used for college admissions and transfers, professional graduate school admissions, employee recruitment, and performance assessment at various companies, and civil service examinations. Our promise is to prepare you for your future. Our promise is to have your English skills recognized everywhere and provide support to you. These promises are the reasons we exist and work hard. We will examine your abilities accurately to strengthen you and bring you closer to fulfilling your dreams. We will be there for your tomorrow. TEPS.
놀이처럼 단어를 외우니까
공부보다는 게임으로 느껴져.
다른 친구들도 이걸 하면서 뭔가 흥미를 느낄 것 같아.